Was pleasure ever a crime? Was a woman's body a ledger, meticulously tracked and taxed by empires? Let's peel back the layers of history, not with dusty scrolls and scholarly debates, but with the grit and whispers of a world obsessed with desire, a world where the scent of incense mingled with the sharper tang of desperation, and where shadows held more secrets than the brightest mosaics. Imagine Alexandria, 300 CE. The air hangs thick with the cries of merchants, the bleating of sheep, and the murmur of 1,000 conversations. Sunlight glints off the harbor, reflecting the ambition of Roman ships laden with silks and spices. But beneath the veneer of prosperity, a darker current flows, a current of women offering themselves, their bodies traded for fleeting moments of intimacy for a few precious coins. These weren't saints, not usually. They were simply women. Women navigating a world that offered them little else. The story begins long before the Christians held sway. The Eastern Mediterranean was already steeped in this practice, a silent trade woven into the fabric of daily life. Think of the legions marching through Syria, weary and yearning for a moment's release. They'd find it in taverns, in bustling marketplaces, in the shadowed corners of bathhouses, places where men gathered, where desires simmered beneath the surface. The government noticed, of course. Taxes were levied, meticulously recorded, a constant reminder that a woman's body was a commodity, a source of revenue for the empire. But the enforcement was selective. Slave girls particularly were a problem. Prostitution was illegal, yes, but the law was a blunt instrument, easily bent to the will of powerful men. The church, predictably, was conflicted. On one hand, the sermons preached of purity and virtue. On the other, the reality was inescapable. Bishops debated, theologians wrangled, but the trade continued, a persistent stain on the otherwise gleaming surface of Christian morality. It wasn't a crime, not officially, but it was certainly frowned upon. Fast forward to the rise of Islam around 630 CE, the landscape shifted dramatically. Suddenly, the Eastern Mediterranean wasn't ruled by Rome, but by a new faith. And surprisingly, the trade didn't vanish. It simply adapted, finding new veins to flow through. The Christian circuses and theaters disappeared, replaced by bustling caravanserais, roadside inns offering shelter and, crucially, companionship. The demand remained, a relentless tide pulling at the shores of the Eastern Mediterranean. Let's meet Layla, a woman born in a small village near Palmyra. She was 16 when her family, struggling to survive, sold her to a merchant who operated a network of brothels along the Silk Road. It wasn't a life of luxury. It was a life of constant movement, of fleeting encounters, of a desperate attempt to earn enough to send a few coins home. She traveled with caravans, navigating treacherous mountain passes and scorching deserts, always aware of the watchful eyes of guards and the ever-present threat of bandits. Then there's Miriam, a Syrian woman who found herself in Antioch, a vibrant city teeming with soldiers, merchants, and pilgrims. She wasn't a slave, she was free, but her circumstances were bleak. Her husband had died, leaving her with 2 young children to feed. Desperate, she turned to the trade, finding work in a discreet inn frequented by travelers. She wasn't proud, but she was resourceful, learning to navigate the complex social dynamics of the city, to protect herself from exploitation, to carve out a small space for herself in a world that offered her so little. The wealthy, of course, played a crucial role, not as patrons necessarily, but as investors. Powerful merchants, ambitious officials, even some religious figures, they saw the potential for profit in this shadowy industry. They owned the caravanserais, the inns, the taverns, providing a safe haven for women like Layla and Miriam. They weren't above exploiting the trade themselves, but they also understood its economic significance. Consider the stories whispered in Mecca, centuries before Islam's rise. There were different forms of cohabitation, of course, but prostitution existed, a dark undercurrent flowing beneath the surface of a society obsessed with pilgrimage and devotion. The concept of sacred prostitution, the idea that women offering sexual services were somehow blessed or elevated, was a complex and often contradictory one. The Muslim rulers, while officially disapproving of procuring and trafficking slaves, didn't outlaw prostitution outright. The laws were nuanced, often reflecting a pragmatic understanding of the realities of the trade. Taxes were levied, meticulously collected, and sometimes even farmed out to women, a strange and unsettling reflection of the power dynamics at play. Imagine a woman, a former prostitute herself, collecting taxes from her former colleagues, a constant reminder of her past and her newfound authority. There's a fascinating detail. Some rulers attempted to solve the problem by encouraging or even forcing women into marriage. A desperate measure driven by a desire to eradicate immorality and perhaps to reduce the tax burden, but it rarely worked. The demand for sexual services remained a fundamental human need that couldn't be easily suppressed. Let's talk about the women themselves. They weren't a homogeneous group. Some were slaves forced into the trade against their will. Others were free, choosing it as a means of survival, a way to earn an independent income in a society that offered them few options. Some ran their own brothels, managing their own businesses and employing other women. And then there were the itinerants, traveling from city to city, seeking out customers wherever they could find them. They wore distinctive clothing, brightly colored robes, elaborate headdresses designed to attract attention, to signal their profession. It was a visual shorthand, a way to navigate a world that often judged them harshly. And what about the Crusaders, invading the Eastern Mediterranean in the 11th and 12th centuries? They brought their own customs, their own expectations, and their own prejudices. They attributed their defeats to the immorality of the local women, a convenient scapegoat for their failures. The Muslims, in turn, captured prostitutes from the Crusader camps, a brutal exchange of prisoners. But the story doesn't end with conquest and bloodshed. It's a story of resilience, of adaptation, of women finding ways to survive and even thrive in a world that sought to control them. They built networks of support, they protected each other, they carved out small spaces of autonomy. The trade wasn't a threat to the social order, it was the social order in a way. It was intertwined with the economy, with the religious institutions, with the political landscape. It was a constant, a persistent reminder of the desires and vulnerabilities of men. Consider this: some religious institutions, mosques and law schools, received donations from prostitutes and brothel operators. Alms were given to the poor, a small act of charity in a world often defined by exploitation. Was it a moral stain? Undoubtedly. Was it a necessary evil? Perhaps. Was it a reflection of a society grappling with desire, power, and the limitations imposed on women? Absolutely. The story of these women is a complex and often uncomfortable one. It's a story of exploitation and resilience, of survival and agency. It's a reminder that history is rarely black and white, that even the darkest corners of the past hold stories of human complexity and contradiction. So the next time you hear the word prostitute, don't think of a nameless, faceless victim. Think of Layla, of Miriam, of all the women who navigated the shadows of the Eastern Mediterranean, their bodies traded, their lives complicated, their stories largely forgotten. And finally, the question remains: if pleasure was a crime, what was the price of freedom?